Hello, weary traveller. I am the lonely knight, and tonight I shall share with you an account about the harsh realities of sleeping within medieval castles, where stone walls offered protection yet denied warmth. I will guide you through what truly happened in those times, the struggles, the faith, the hunger, and the resilience that shaped the lives of those who came before us. Now, make yourself comfortable, for the story is about to begin. I often find myself wondering, where are you listening from tonight? And what hour of the day finds you as my voice reaches you? When I cast my thoughts back to the twilight of Rome, I recall a continent suddenly left without its shield. The collapse of the Western Empire in the 5th century unstitched the fabric of security, and chaos poured through the gaps. Roads once patrolled by disciplined legions fell silent, while tribes and warbands carved their paths through vulnerable lands. In this void, the old order crumbled, and Europe's people searched desperately for new ways to protect themselves from the constant threats pressing on their borders. At first, defenses rose in wood, humble palisades encircling manors and villages. These wooden walls stood quickly against raiders, but the flame was always their undoing. A single torch could reduce months of labor to cinders in a night. The memory of such fragility haunted every lord and peasant alike, and so whispers began that only stone, ancient and immovable, could provide the sanctuary they longed for. It was not wealth alone, but fear that laid the foundation for castles. The earliest fortifications took form as motte and bailey structures, a raised mound crowned with a keep and encircled by ditches and wooden walls. They were born from necessity, quick to build, commanding in their height. Yet their impermanence weighed heavily on the minds of those within. In time, these wooden defences gave way to the permanence of stone, each block a promise of resistance to fire and steel. A new silhouette began to dominate the landscapes of Europe. Stone brought strength, but it also carried new burdens. These walls rose thick and unyielding, their coldness seeping into every corner of life. Unlike the graceful Roman villas that once enjoyed the luxury of hypocaust heating, these fortresses were designed for war, not comfort. Their builders cared little for warmth of hearth or softness of sleep. Defense was the guiding principle, and human needs bent beneath it like branches in a storm. Within those walls, daily life reshaped itself. People no longer lived in airy dwellings with courtyards and mosaics, but in narrow shadowed chambers that smelled of damp stone. The transition was not gentle, for generations had grown accustomed to the Roman way of life, with its public baths, markets, and organized towns. To step into a castle was to step into a world stripped of those refinements, where survival outweighed all else. It is often said that castles were symbols of power, yet I recall them more as symbols of unease. A lord did not raise high walls merely to display grandeur, but to assure himself against neighbors, invaders, and his own rebellious vassals. Each tower was a confession of vulnerability, an admission that only by hiding behind stone could one feel safe. The cold beauty of the battlements masked the deeper truth of fear. These fortresses changed the rhythm of human existence. Villages clustered near their shadows, peasants tethered to the stronghold that both protected and commanded them. Life, labor, and even faith bent toward the castle, for it was the anchor in uncertain seas. And yet, within those walls, men, women, and children learned to sleep poorly, for stone was no friend to comfort. It offered safety, yes, but never warmth. Thus, from the ashes of Rome, a new order rose, one of stone, towers, and narrow halls. I walked among them and felt both awe and sorrow, for these creations bore witness to human resilience and to human fear alike. They were the bones of a Europe remade, where defense was prized above rest, and where the very walls that guarded the body often left the spirit shivering in the cold silence of the night. I remember stepping into the heart of a castle and feeling the weight of stone press upon me, not only in its grandeur, but in its chill. The walls that towered in defense by day turned merciless at night, breathing out a damp cold that clung to the skin. Stone has no kindness in it, no memory of the sun. It absorbed little warmth from the fleeting daylight and returned to us nothing but shadows and frost. Even in summer, its embrace was a reminder that strength does not equal comfort. Unlike the Roman world that once warmed its villas with hippocausts, the castles of medieval Europe offered no such ingenuity. The floors were hard and unyielding, bereft of the undercurrent of heat that Romans enjoyed. Where once mosaics glowed with warmth from fires below, medieval families huddled above raw earth or frigid flagstones. The contrast between those lost luxuries and the stark realities of stone fortresses could not be more striking. In every step, one felt the absence of Rome's engineering. The builders of castles did not seek to bring ease to their residents. Their eyes were fixed on sieges, on arrows, and on the fire-hardened determination of enemies. Walls were raised to repel armies, not to shelter sleepers. Comfort was sacrificed at every turn, and the coldness of those stones became a silent companion through the centuries. Every lord and servant alike bore witness to the same truth. These walls defended, but they did not embrace. In winter months, the suffering grew severe. Frost clung to the inside of walls as though mocking the efforts of fires and firs. Breath hung visibly in the air, curling like ghosts above the pallets and beds. I can still recall the shiver that settled deep in the bones, a cold that no hearth could fully banish. Castles were not places of rest, but of endurance, and sleep itself felt like a battle against the elements. Even tapestries, thickly woven and hung with care, could not silence the stone's cold breath. They softened echoes and dampened drafts, but behind them, the walls remained unyielding. The very fabric of life within a fortress was stitched with this tension: survival against enemies without, and against the merciless stone within. The greater the walls, the greater the chill, for size magnified not only strength, but also the emptiness of warmth. The noble sought refuge in smaller chambers, attempting to carve out corners of warmth amidst the expanse. Fires were lit in hearths, braziers placed nearby, yet the heat dissipated quickly into the stone. What comfort could be grasped was fleeting, and even the wealthy wrapped themselves in layer upon layer. Luxury in such places was not extravagance, but the desperate pursuit of tolerable nights. For servants and retainers, the struggle was harsher still. They lay close to the ground, where the stone's chill seeped most cruelly. Their thin bedding offered little defense, and the damp air gnawed at their lungs. I often thought that the cold was a kind of equalizer, touching lord and servant alike, though each bore it in different measure. In the silence of night, all knew the weight of stone's indifference, and so the castles, monuments to power and protection, revealed their hidden cost. They stood eternal against invaders, yet offered their people no mercy from the cold. I learned in those halls that stone has two faces, one that defies the sword and the flame, and another that turns every night into a trial. In defending life, it also denied ease, leaving behind memories carved not only in mortar, but in shivering flesh. The first thing that struck me upon entering many a fortress was the windows, or rather the narrow slits that pretended to serve as such. They were arrow loops, built for defense, not for comfort. Light filtered in reluctantly, while cold winds swept through eagerly, carrying with them the bite of the outside world. There was no glass to soften their breath in most places, only shutters of wood or cloth that rattled with every gust. To sleep near such an opening was to invite the winter directly into one's bones. Glass did appear in time, but it was as precious as jewels. Only the wealthiest lords could afford to place panes in their chambers, and even then the glass was uneven, casting distorted glimmers rather than clear views. For most, the choice lay between heavy shutters that blocked light and air entirely, or thin oiled cloth stretched across frames. That cloth shimmered faintly, but it did little more than mock the notion of warmth. Drafts slipped past as though determined never to be denied. At night, When silence settled across the fortress, the sound of the wind became a constant companion. It whistled through every crack, rattled doors, and fluttered tapestries. I remember lying awake, listening to it, as though the very walls were sighing with exhaustion. Those sighs were not comforting. They reminded every soul within that the castle, for all its strength, was porous to the chill of the world outside. The enemy was not only man, but the ceaseless breath of winter. Some attempted to seal the openings with furs, hanging them over frames or stuffing gaps with straw, yet nothing endured for long against dampness and rot. The cold returned as faithfully as the dawn. Even the great halls where many gathered for warmth were not immune. Smoke from the hearth rose sluggishly while draughts rushed low across the floor, leaving feet and legs numbed even in the presence of fire. Comfort was always partial, never whole. The poor, sleeping on rushes near these slits, bore the worst of it. I recall seeing their blankets flutter faintly with every gust, as though invisible hands were tugging them away. Children shivered in the night, their cries muffled under wool and straw. Those who served the household often knew little of deep sleep. Instead, they endured a restless dozing, woken again and again by the sting of draughts cutting across their bedding. For nobles, the solar chambers offered some relief, though not immunity. Even behind carved shutters and decorated hangings, the cold crept in. A candle flame bent sideways with every whisper of wind, proof that no chamber was truly sealed. This was the paradox of castles. Walls thick enough to turn aside armies, yet windows so slight that the smallest breath of air could pierce a night's rest. Strength and fragility existed side by side. It is easy now, in an age of sealed windows and warm panes, to forget what such air once meant. Today we speak of a draught as an inconvenience. Then it was a nightly adversary. To live in a castle was to live at the mercy of stone and sky alike, caught between the fortitude of walls and the betrayal of their openings. Every night reminded one that nature's persistence outlasts human design. I came to think of those draughts as voices, whispering truths we preferred not to hear. They told us that comfort was fleeting, that no fortress was absolute, and that survival often came not from conquest, but from endurance. The wind was a teacher, though a harsh one, and its lessons echoed through every sleepless night, rattling shutters and tugging at weary hearts. There was no place within a castle that carried more weight in daily life than the great hall. It was the centre of gathering, the heart where meals were shared, judgments delivered, and alliances affirmed. Yet when the torches dimmed and the noise of feasting gave way to silence, that same hall became a sleeping ground for many. The vast space, meant to symbolize power, was transformed each night into a refuge for retainers, servants, and travelers seeking a place to rest. At the core of the hall stood the great hearth, a fire whose embers glowed through long hours. Its warmth promised comfort, but only for those fortunate enough to sleep nearby. The heat rarely reached the edges of the chamber, where shadows swallowed the cold once more. Servants crowded close to the flames until the risk of sparks forced them back, leaving their bodies suspended between comfort and danger. The hearth was both a gift and a menace. The smoke that rose from those fires was seldom guided away efficiently. Before chimneys became common, the air within hung thick, irritated the eyes, and clung to every garment. I recall lying with cloak pulled over my face, torn between the bite of cold draughts at my feet and the sting of smoke that stifled the breath. Rest was possible, but never pure. One endured rather than truly slept in the haze of fire and frost. The sound of night in the hall was its own chorus. Dogs shifted near the fire, men stirred on straw pallets, and whispers carried across the darkened space. The groan of beams and the hiss of wind through cracks joined the symphony. Sleep came in fragments, broken by coughs, the scurry of vermin, or the bark of a restless hound. What was meant to be a chamber of unity and daylight became, in night's silence, a place of uneasy slumber. Those of noble rank seldom remained in the hall once darkness fell. Their steps carried them upward to private quarters, leaving the hall to those who served them. Yet even for the lords, the echoes of the great hall never disappeared, for it was here their people slept, vulnerable to cold and draught, yet bound to the heart of the castle's life. To rule a fortress was to know that your power rested on the weary bodies stretched across its floor. The floor itself told stories. Covered with rushes that absorbed the waste and spilled drink of the day, it was never truly clean. When men and women lay upon it at night, they accepted discomfort as part of their station. The smell of old straw mixed with smoke and dampness, creating an atmosphere that wrapped itself around every dream. One did not seek peace in such surroundings, only the brief mercy of rest. For many, the hall was the only option, no matter the hardships. It offered shelter from the outside, and though drafts entered freely, the safety of stone walls meant life within them was preferable to life without. Sleep on the hall floor was harsh, but it was still safer than open fields where raiders or wolves prowled. The castle, however cold, was a shield of survival, and men accepted its flaws with silent endurance. When I recall those nights, I see the flicker of firelight playing across weary faces. I hear the shuffle of cloaks pulled tighter against the cold. The great hall was not a place of ease, but it was where human resilience gathered night after night. There, in the mingling of smoke and shadow, the strength of a household was tested, not in battle, but in the simple act of enduring until morning. As castles grew in complexity, those who ruled them sought corners of greater privacy. By the 12th century, the great lords and ladies retreated from the open life of the hall into chambers known as solas, perched above the bustle of daily labour. These spaces were designed to separate authority from common company, granting the noble household a semblance of seclusion. Yet the stone walls followed them there, cold and unrelenting, indifferent to rank or title. Solitude did not mean warmth. Within those elevated rooms, efforts were made to soften the harshness of stone. Floors were covered with woven mats, walls draped with hangings, and benches lined with cushions. Yet no matter how finely wrought, such adornments could not chase away the draughts that crept through cracks or the damp that clung to masonry. The air remained heavy with chill, and the body was forced to rely on layers of cloth and fur to endure the night. The bed itself became a fortress within the fortress. Great wooden frames were built, often with heavy curtains that could be drawn tight to trap whatever heat the body produced. Feather mattresses and woolen blankets piled high, yet even in such arrangements, sleep was uncertain. The effort to create a cocoon of warmth was constant, and the noble family's rest was as much a matter of management as of luxury. Candles and braziers glowed faintly in the corners, their flames too weak to conquer the breadth of the room. Smoke often lingered, caught in the still air, leaving behind a haze that stung the eyes. Even those who commanded armies and ruled estates coughed through the night, aware that their authority did not spare them from discomfort. The stone gave nothing freely, and each ember of warmth had to be fought for. These private spaces also bore the weight of symbolism. To have a chamber apart from the hall marked status, a visible boundary between ruler and ruled. Yet this boundary did not erase hardship, it only redefined it. Nobles endured cold in solitude, while their retainers endured it in company. In both cases, the body trembled beneath stone ceilings, a reminder that all shared the same winter. Children of noble birth shared these chambers with attendants, their cradles pulled near hearths if any existed. Wrapped in wool and guarded by nurses, they learned from infancy that life in a castle was inseparable from cold. Growing up behind stone walls was not the idyllic existence imagined later in tales, but one defined by vigilance and resilience. Even privilege could not insulate the young from the environment. When storms beat against the towers, the sound carried through the chambers like a drum. Curtains stirred, shutters rattled, and the fire bent low. Those within listened to the fury of the elements, their hearts uneasy, their sleep broken. To rule from a castle was not to escape nature, but to be constantly reminded of its presence, pressing against every seam and slit. I think often of how these lords and ladies, wrapped in furs, whispered prayers before surrendering to the night. Their wealth bought layers of cloth, carved furniture, and feather beds, yet not comfort itself. In the end, they lay down like any other soul within those walls, bracing themselves against the cold, surrendering to rest that came only in fragments. Stone equalized more than it divided. The place where one lay at night revealed much about the realities of life within a castle. For most, the bed was not a feathered haven, but a simple sack stuffed with straw, called a tick. These beds were cheap to make and easy to replace, yet they were far from comfortable. Straw broke down quickly, growing flat and musty, its sharp ends poking through the cloth. To lie upon it was to feel the uneven ridges of stalks pressing into bone, reminding the body that softness was rare. The fresh scent of new straw did not last long. With every night spent tossing and turning, the bedding grew damp from sweat and breath, absorbing the chill of the air. In a matter of weeks, the straw would sour, carrying the smell of mildew and the faint stench of decay. Servants replaced it when they could, but in many households, resources were too precious for frequent renewal. Thus, people endured beds that were less a comfort than a burden. Infestation was the bedfellow none could ignore. Lice nested easily within the straw, feeding on the blood of sleepers. Fleas leapt freely between folds of cloth and straw, their bites leaving welts that tormented the skin. Even rats found their way into such bedding, drawn by warmth or crumbs left from hurried meals. Rest was broken again and again by scratching, shifting and swatting as men and women fought unseen enemies through the night. For nobles, the problem was softened but not erased. Their beds might contain feathers rather than straw, yet pests respected no boundaries of rank. Records tell of queens and kings alike suffering from lice, their attendants tasked with combing them away. Even the finest draperies and silken sheets could not guarantee a night free from crawling irritation. The castle, for all its grandeur, could not cleanse itself of these small but relentless foes. The poor bore the heavier weight, as they often shared their straw ticks with family members or companions. Crowded together for warmth, they multiplied the ease with which lice and fleas spread. Children scratched until their skin bled, mothers tried to soothe them, and men woke weary from a sleep that offered no true rest. The cold stone walls were cruel, but the living presence of vermin was crueler still. Efforts were made to fight back. Herbs such as lavender or wormwood were sometimes scattered into bedding, their scents meant to deter pests. The ticks themselves were beaten or shaken outdoors, though this offered only temporary relief. Some households burned the old straw entirely, filling sacks anew. But these measures demanded time and resources, and so neglect was common, leaving many to endure long nights of itch and unease. To lie in such conditions was to be reminded that the body was never fully one's own. Sleep became an act of surrender, not to peace, but to discomfort. Men rose in the morning already weary, carrying into their labours the fatigue of a night half spent in battle against invisible foes. What little warmth their bedding offered came at the price of restlessness, making each day a continuation of the night's struggle. I often reflect that the grandeur of castles was a mask, hiding the human truth within. Beneath the banners and battlements, men and women scratched at bites, shifted on sour straw, and prayed for a night unbroken. Stone walls might have promised protection from raiders and fire, but they offered no defense against the smallest of creatures. And so, even in safety, the nights were restless, and the dream of comfort was always fleeting. The nobility may have had chambers to retreat to, but the servants of the castle lived in the margins. Their duties filled the daylight hours, and when night came, they sought corners where they might rest. Many lay close to the kitchens, where warmth lingered faintly from the great ovens. Others found space in corridors, under staircases, or in storerooms, their bedding nothing more than cloaks spread across stone. These makeshift resting places revealed the stark divide between those who commanded and those who served. The kitchens were both a blessing and a danger. Fires used for roasting and boiling left the air heavy with heat, but also with smoke and grease. Sleeping nearby meant warmth, but also the risk of burns or suffocation should embers escape. The smell of cooked meat and spilled ale lingered, seeping into clothing and hair. For weary servants, the choice was simple: to endure discomfort and risk, or to freeze elsewhere in the castle's draft-ridden halls. Others slept in stables, curled among the animals they tended. The warmth of horses and cattle made these spaces more tolerable than bare chambers, yet such comfort came with filth, the constant stench of dung, and the company of rodents that thrived in grain stores. I remember watching boys settle down beside the animals, their arms wrapped tightly around themselves, learning young that survival often demanded compromise with hardship. Servants' bedding was seldom more than straw or old sacks. Unlike the more carefully kept mattresses of their masters, these lay directly on cold ground or wooden planks. Vermin thrived here too, biting and crawling through the night. To the noble eye, these were invisible sufferings, unnoticed unless complaints grew too loud. But to the servant, the nightly battle with cold, pests, and foul air was as real as any task performed in daylight. The fatigue of broken rest did not excuse them from duty. At dawn, they rose, often before their masters stirred, to light fires, fetch water, and prepare meals. Their bodies bore the weight of sleepless nights, yet their service was unbroken. In the silence of their suffering, they revealed a resilience that history seldom honors, but which every castle relied upon. Without their endurance, the fortress could not function. Even in these harsh conditions, companionship softened the burden. Servants often slept in groups, their bodies pressed close for warmth. Quiet conversations, whispered prayers, and shared laughter before sleep offered fleeting comfort. Such bonds forged in hardship became lifelines, carrying men and women through long winters when every breath misted in the air. Though unrecorded by chroniclers, this quiet humanity was as much a part of castle life as the stone itself. It is telling that the lowest found ways to endure where even the highest struggled. Their strength lay not in silk or fur, but in acceptance of their lot and the ability to wring warmth from the smallest sources. A kitchen's glow, a stable's hay, the closeness of a companion, these were their defenses against the night. Each resting place, no matter how poor, spoke of a will to survive within unforgiving walls. When I reflect upon those who lived in shadowed corners, I see their quiet heroism more clearly than the banners that flew above the towers. The lords may have owned the castle, but it was the servants who carried its weight, awake and asleep alike. Their nights were colder, their bedding harsher, yet their endurance was steady as the stone that surrounded them. In their silence, they revealed a strength history cannot erase. 8. Hearths and the problem of smoke. Few comforts mattered more in a medieval castle than fire. Without it, the cold of stone walls would have been unbearable, yet the very flames meant to save also brought their own misery. Early hearths were open and crude, their smoke curling upward in uncertain spirals. With no proper chimneys, the fumes often lingered in the chamber, filling lungs and eyes with acrid sting. I recall the sting of tears, not from sorrow, but from smoke thick enough to blur the outlines of the walls themselves. Openings in the roof were the simplest solution, yet they rarely sufficed. Smoke gathered under rafters before drifting out in reluctant streams. The air below remained hazy, heavy, and suffocating. Those who slept near the hearth awoke with throats raw, their breathing labored, and their blankets scented with soot. To choose the warmth of fire was to accept the punishment of smoke, a bargain repeated night after night. It was survival purchased with discomfort. The Great Hall suffered most from this burden. Its vast size meant that fires were made larger, their smoke more abundant, their reach more oppressive. Servants sprawled on the floor had no escape. Whether they turned toward the hearth or away from it, they breathed in the residue of burning wood. The eyes of men grew red, children coughed in their sleep, and even the loyal dogs sneezed in the haze. Such was the price of gathering under one roof. When chimneys appeared in the 12th century, they marked a turning point. At last, smoke could be channeled upward and outward, allowing rooms to hold warmth with clearer air. Yet these improvements spread slowly, their construction costly, and their use limited to wealthier castles. For many generations, countless households continued to endure the smoke, their nights darkened not only by cold, but by choking fumes. Innovation came late to comfort. The wealthy could at least retreat to chambers with smaller, better managed fireplaces. Even then, smoke was not banished entirely. Drafts sometimes sent it spiraling back into the room, filling tapestries and clothing with its bitter odor. A noble bedchamber was lined with fine cloth, yet the smell of wood smoke clung to every fold, reminding its owner that stone did not easily yield to human will. Comfort was never without compromise. For servants, there was little chance of escape. If they lay far from the fire, the cold gnawed at their bodies. If they drew closer, they risked sparks setting straw alight, or smoke suffocating their rest. I have seen bedding scorched from stray embers, blankets singed, and men startled awake by the sudden glow of fire at their feet. The line between warmth and danger was razor thin. Medical accounts of the age speak of ailments tied to such conditions: inflamed lungs, persistent coughs, and watering eyes. The smoke that filled castles was not simply nuisance, but a genuine hazard to health. People learned to endure it as they endured hunger or hardship, weaving it into the rhythm of their days. Suffering was accepted as natural, even holy, in a time when patience through discomfort was seen as a path to virtue. Whenever I think back to those nights, I see the fire's glow dancing on stone, hear the crackle of wood, and feel the sting of smoke in my throat. The hearth was both friend and foe, offering life while stealing ease. In the silence of the night, one came to understand that survival in a castle was a constant trade, where every comfort carried its shadow. Fire gave warmth, but never without a price. Moisture was a constant adversary inside the walls of a fortress. Thick masonry, meant to repel siege and flame, trapped dampness as though it were a prisoner. The cold stone absorbed water from rains and rising ground, releasing it slowly into chambers. Even in rooms where fires burned, the air felt clammy, and the breath of the walls seemed heavy with dew. To live inside a castle was to live alongside an ever-present chill that crept into clothing, bedding, and flesh alike. Bedding rarely escaped the grasp of dampness. Straw, wool, and even costly feather mattresses absorbed the moisture of the air, leaving them cold and clammy to the touch. Blankets smelled faintly of mildew, and no amount of shaking seemed to banish it. Those who laid themselves down at night often felt as though they were sleeping in a cellar. Dreams unfolded under the weight of moisture, broken by the shiver that seeped from mattress to bone. Tapestries, meant to soften the walls, bore their own burden. They trapped damp air, holding it close, and sometimes bloomed with mold. Bright colours dulled, threads weakened, and the scent of decay lingered in chambers adorned with even the finest cloth. What was meant to symbolize status and beauty became instead a canvas of silent rot. The effort to create warmth through decoration was constantly undermined by the persistence of moisture. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable. Their lungs weakened in the musty air, and coughs carried through corridors like a second language of suffering. Physicians of the time noted such ailments, describing phlegm, chills, and fevers tied to the cold breath of stone. No amount of prayer or poultice could erase the fact that the very structure meant to protect life often compromised health. The castle defended against enemies, but harboured sickness in its damp embrace. Even the great halls, with their blazing hearths, could not escape. Heat rose upward, leaving the floor damp and cold, while smoke mixed with moisture to form a heavy haze. Food stored in such spaces spoiled quickly, barrels swelling and bread softening before its time. To live behind stone walls was to live in battle not only with men, but with the elements themselves, seeping in from unseen cracks and saturating every surface. The poor had little choice but to accept it. Their straw ticks turned musty within weeks, their clothing never fully dry, their feet perpetually chilled. They worked through days in damp tunics, slept in damp blankets, and woke with coughs that grew into chronic afflictions. Even nobles, wrapped in furs and silks, could not claim victory over the clamminess that filled their chambers. The damp equalized, sparing no rank. Monks and clerics who chronicled these conditions often described the suffering with a tone of resignation. To them, discomfort was part of divine testing, a burden to be borne for the sake of the soul. Dampness became not just a physical trial, but a spiritual lesson in endurance. Yet I cannot forget how it gnawed at the body, weakening those already frail, and turning the silence of the night into a chorus of coughs. I have walked through those chambers and felt the walls sweating under my hand. I have breathed the musty air and known how it clung to skin and soul. The dampness of castles was not a passing inconvenience, but a companion, as permanent as the stone itself. It taught that strength in one form often came with weakness in another, and that survival demanded acceptance of the cold breath of walls that would never grow warm. The passage of the year weighed heavily upon those who dwelled in stone fortresses. Winter descended with a cruelty that no tapestry or hearth could fully resist, each night stretching long beneath frost-covered walls. Breath clouded in the air, water froze in buckets, and men rose with aching joints. To endure such cold demanded layers of wool and fur, yet even then sleep was broken by the bite of draughts. Survival itself seemed tested each time darkness fell across the land. Summer offered no simple relief. In the upper chambers, heat gathered beneath the heavy roofs, stifling and relentless. Airflow was poor, for windows were small and narrow, designed for defense rather than comfort. The stone that had chilled bodies in winter now trapped heat like a furnace, pressing upon the lungs and leaving men restless. Sweat dampened bedding, and the nights became as uneasy as those of midwinter, though for opposite reasons. Autumn brought its own difficulties, as rains swept through and left the walls dripping with moisture. Floors became slick, and clothing hung heavy with dampness. Fires were lit in vain to drive away the clammy air, but they only filled the rooms with smoke. The scent of mildew crept into every corner, and bedding absorbed the damp until it smelled more of earth than of cloth. The season of harvest was also the season of sodden nights. Spring should have promised renewal, but within castles it was a time of drought and uncertainty. Melted snow seeped into foundations, filling chambers with chill dampness. The winds of March swept freely through unsealed windows and roof gaps. Though blossoms appeared outside, those within the walls still shivered under blankets, waiting for the brief warmth of day to ease the lingering cold of night. Hope stirred, yet comfort remained elusive. The cycle of the year was thus a cycle of suffering. Relief was always partial, fleeting, undone by the next turn of season. There was no true balance, no season in which sleep came freely and without hardship. The castle magnified nature's extremes, shielding its people from attack, yet exposing them to the merciless rhythm of weather. Every turn of the calendar was a reminder that comfort had no lasting home in such walls. Those of wealth might lessen the struggle with finer furs, thicker blankets, or more secluded chambers, but they too felt the sting. Even kings recorded the misery of bitter cold winters or suffocating summers. For servants and soldiers there was no escape at all. Their bodies endured the full measure of the season's weight. In silence they bore it, knowing that complaint changed nothing against stone and sky. I often thought of the peasants beyond the walls. Their cottages, low-roofed and humble, held warmth more easily in winter and released heat more quickly in summer. Though vulnerable to danger, they sometimes rested more soundly than those wrapped in stone towers. The irony was not lost upon me. Those meant to be safest often knew the most restless sleep. Protection carried its own burdens. Seasons pass, yet the memory of them lingers. I can still feel the icy winds that stole through narrow slits in January, and the suffocating heat that pressed upon solars in July. Castles were fortresses against men, but never against nature. In their grandeur, they stood unyielding. In their chambers, they taught humility, for no lord could command the turning of the year. Among the few defences men had against the cold of castle nights were the layers they pulled over themselves. Wool was the most common, coarse yet dependable, and it formed the base of nearly every bed. Those of wealth surrounded themselves with furs, bear, wolf, ermine, and sable, symbols of power as much as sources of warmth. I remember seeing noble chambers lined with skins, their weight pressing heavily upon the sleepers. The coverings shielded them from drafts, but never banished the chill entirely. The poor could rarely afford such luxury. Their coverings were thin, patched together from worn cloth or woven blankets passed down until threadbare. A single cloak often served as both garment by day and bedding by night. Families huddled together beneath it, using their own body heat to fill the void left by absent furs. They endured, though they shivered, while the nobility enjoyed the illusion of comfort behind their heavy layers. Featherbeds, prized by the wealthy, provided a softness unknown to most. Filled with down plucked from geese, they offered relief from the hardness of straw ticks. Yet even lying upon feathers, the body still felt the cold pressing upward from stone floors and downward from unyielding walls. Warmth was fleeting, slipping away into the vast chambers. What luxury promised, reality often betrayed, for castles were relentless in reminding their inhabitants of nature's dominance. The weight of blankets themselves was immense. Some were piled so high that turning in sleep became difficult. Men and women lay pinned beneath their coverings, half smothered by the very protection they sought. In those moments, I wondered if warmth was worth the cost of freedom of movement. Yet, in the depth of winter, choice mattered little. Stillness beneath heavy blankets was preferable to the sharp bite of exposed air. Beyond mere comfort, furs carried a mark of status. Kings and queens were draped in ermine, while lesser nobles settled for fox or sheep's wool. Inventories of noble households list these coverings with as much care as they do swords or jewels, for they proclaimed wealth in the face of hardship. Yet even the most expensive pelt could not silence the drafts that crept under doors or through unglazed windows. Symbolism offered no protection against the realities of stone. For children, blankets and furs were piled generously, but attendants often kept close watch, fearful of suffocation under their weight. Cradles were lined with wool, and small bodies wrapped in layer upon layer. Despite such care, illness often took root, for the damp and chill found its way into every chamber. The struggle to keep the young warm was constant, reflecting the unending war between comfort and the environment. When guests visited, their accommodations were judged not by grandeur alone, but by the coverings provided. Chroniclers tell of nobles complaining about cold nights in unfamiliar halls, even when honoured with gifts of fine blankets. Hospitality demanded generosity of warmth, for all knew that a sleepless, shivering night was a mark of neglect. Thus, the giving of furs became not only necessity, but also diplomacy. In my own memory, the image remains clear. Men and women disappearing beneath mounds of fabric, their breath rising into the cold air as if from caves. The warmth they found was temporary, the cold never fully driven away. The heavy blankets were shields, yes, but shields that reminded their bearers of the battle being fought, night after night, against the unrelenting stone and the seasons pressing at its walls. When darkness fell and duties were set aside, the question of how one dressed for rest became clear. There were no finely sewn pajamas such as we know today. Instead, Men and women wore what was at hand: long linen shirts, often the same garments they had worked in during the day. These shifts, simple and practical, absorbed sweat and provided a thin layer against the cold. Yet linen alone could not hold warmth, and so sleep itself became an act of endurance more than comfort. Among the wealthy, additional garments were adopted to soften the night. Nobles sometimes pulled woolen robes over their shifts, or wrapped themselves in cloaks before retreating beneath blankets. Caps and coifs, made of linen or wool, became common, pulled snug over the head to preserve heat. I recall seeing inventories that listed such items with care, proof that they were not luxuries but necessities. The night air within stone walls made even the head vulnerable to frost. Illustrations from manuscripts reveal the truth clearly. Men lie beneath heavy covers, their heads peeking out under soft caps, while women rest in long gowns with sleeves falling loose. These images, made by monks and scribes, were not fanciful. They mirrored the lived experience of those who slept within castles and cloisters alike. Every fold of fabric spoke of survival, every layer an answer to the relentless chill of night. Children, too, were wrapped carefully, sometimes bound in swaddling for warmth. Their heads were covered with tiny caps, and their bodies encased in layers of wool. Mothers and nurses knew well that a child left uncovered could fall prey to illness quickly. The act of dressing for sleep was not tender ritual, but a matter of life, repeated with vigilance through the long winters. Protection of the young was woven in cloth and care. Servants, by contrast, had fewer choices. Their sleepwear was often indistinguishable from their work garments. A single shift might serve them through both day and night, until it grew too worn to cover decently. They had no spare robes, no soft caps, only the warmth of shared bodies and thin blankets. Their vulnerability was sharper, their nights colder, yet they endured, adapting to hardship as naturally as breathing. The use of nightcaps lasted long beyond the Middle Ages, surviving into later centuries when fireplaces and chimneys had improved. It was a testament to their usefulness. In castles, though, they were indispensable. A head left bare in winter risked not only discomfort, but frostbite, as the breath of stone could chill even the strongest. The cap was a simple solution to a problem that no wealth of stone or power could erase. Religious communities adopted similar practices. Monks slept in their habits, often covered only by coarse blankets, but they too relied on hoods or caps. Their discipline demanded rising in the middle of the night for prayer, and so warmth was ever in question. Even those who embraced suffering as piety did not ignore the need for cloth over the head. Faith guided their spirit, but simple fabric shielded their flesh. When I recall those nights, I picture rows of figures curled under blankets, their heads capped like sentinels against the cold. Sleepwear was not vanity, it was survival, stitched from necessity. The image remains etched in memory: linen shifts, woolen robes, and humble caps, reminders that even in castles of power, human frailty demanded care. Against stone's merciless breath, cloth was the only shield one carried into dreams. Silence never truly settled within the walls of a fortress. Even as torches dimmed and fires dwindled to embers, the sound of vigilance continued. Guards walked their rounds upon the battlements, their boots echoing against stone, iron weapons clinking softly at their sides. From time to time, the hollow call of a watchman pierced the night, a ritual cry to prove he had not succumbed to sleep. The castle rested, but it never slumbered wholly. Dogs were another voice in the darkness. Their ears caught movements beyond the walls, and their barking broke through the stillness. Sometimes they warned of prowlers, sometimes of nothing more than shifting shadows or the wind stirring branches. Yet each sound roused unease, reminding every sleeper that danger was never far. Sleep came shallow in such moments, for one never knew when the barking foretold true alarm. The portcullis itself could sound in the night. Chains creaked, gates shifted, and the echo of iron reverberated through the halls. Even the smallest adjustment in the defences carried through stone corridors, startling those lying on straw or feather alike. The weight of such noises was heavy upon the mind, for they were constant reminders of both safety and threat. The walls shielded, but the night beyond them remained full of uncertainty. Inside the halls, the shuffling of servants added to the chorus. Some tended to fires, others prepared for duties that would greet dawn. The scurry of mice and rats, too, was never absent, their tiny claws scratching against wooden boards. Sleepers stirred and shifted, never fully sinking into rest, for the night's sounds wove themselves into every dream. The body lay still, but the ears never ceased listening. For the guards, sleeplessness was demanded by duty. Hours were divided among men, each responsible for a section of wall or gate. A lapse could mean disaster, so their vigilance was unrelenting. To them, the sound of footsteps on stone was both their own burden and the comfort of knowing another man kept watch elsewhere. Each sound confirmed survival through another hour. The nobility, though shielded in their chambers, were not immune to the unrest. Their ears caught the echoes of movement below, the sudden barking of hounds, or the clank of arms. Even the wealthiest bed could not silence such interruptions. The knowledge that their safety rested on the wakefulness of others left them uneasy. A lord might sleep beneath ermine, but still he woke at the sound of iron on stone. These sounds carried through seasons and centuries, part of the very identity of castle life. To dwell within those walls was to live with noise not of celebration, but of vigilance. Peace was measured not in silence, but in the rhythm of footsteps, the bark of dogs, the clash of metal. It was the soundscape of survival, familiar to all who lived beneath battlements. I often think of those nights when the fire dimmed and the stars hung bright beyond the towers. Rest was a fragile gift, broken by the smallest stir. Yet in that unease lay a truth. Safety was never certain, and even in stone strongholds, one depended on the wakefulness of others. The night watch was not only a duty, but the heartbeat of the castle, steady and unyielding, echoing through every restless sleep. Every castle relied on fire, yet the flames that offered life also threatened destruction. Open hearths and torches flickered against stone, their light pushing back the shadows but never entirely safe. Straw mattresses, wooden floors, and thick tapestries were all tinder, waiting for a single spark. I can still recall the unease that accompanied lying down near a hearth, knowing warmth might turn to danger in a heartbeat. Safety and peril burned together in the same flame. In great halls, where fires blazed more fiercely, the risk was magnified. Servants stretched themselves close to the embers, chasing heat in the bitter months. But sparks leapt unpredictably, landing on cloaks or bedding, forcing sudden movements and fearful glances. The comfort of warmth was always tempered by the knowledge that too much closeness could summon disaster. Men learned to sleep lightly, ready to stir at the faintest crackle of wood. Tapestries hung proudly from the walls, symbols of wealth and artistry, yet they too betrayed the household. A wandering flame or wayward torch could climb their threads in moments, spreading fire faster than any hand could smother. Smoke would fill the chamber before cries could summon help. Castles were thought indestructible, but fire knew no rank, and many a lord learned that even stone fortresses could be undone by burning cloth. Not all fires were open. Braziers and candles carried their own dangers, flickering quietly in corners or beside beds. A noble might fall asleep beneath the glow of a candle, only to wake to the scent of burning linen. Servants bore the task of keeping flames under watch, yet their fatigue was real, and accidents were never far away. The smallest flame could consume more than the mightiest sword. Some chambers chose to remain cold rather than risk the hazard. Better to shiver through the night than awaken to smoke and panic. This choice was no easy one. Frozen limbs against suffocation, numbness against destruction. Each night was marked by the same calculation, whether to suffer cold or gamble on fire. Both paths held misery, but at least cold killed slowly, while fire struck without warning. Records speak of fires that consumed entire keeps, despite stone walls meant to endure centuries. Roofs of timber collapsed, furniture blazed, and treasures were lost in moments. Survivors described the terror of running barefoot across flagstones, their lungs filled with choking smoke. The memory of such events lingered for generations, shaping how households treated every flame as both savior and enemy. The poor within castles bore the sharpest edge of this fear. Their bedding of straw and rushes ignited with ease, and their sleeping spots lay closest to the hearth. They had no distance, no chamber to separate them from danger. Every spark was a reminder that their pursuit of warmth might also be their undoing. Still they slept there, for the cold offered no kinder fate. When I think back, I see the dual face of fire, its glow comforting the weary, its sparks threatening all within reach. In the silence of night, its crackle was both lullaby and alarm. The castle walls could not guard against it, for danger lived within, not without. Thus, sleep in such places was always shadowed by flame, a fragile rest taken in trust that the night would not end in fire's fury. The body was never meant to thrive in unyielding cold, and the walls of a castle tested flesh without mercy. Nights spent shivering beneath heavy covers left men and women with aching joints that never healed. Rheumatism, as we would call it now, was the price of sleeping in chambers that never warmed. I remember elders hobbling through corridors, their movements stiff, their pain constant, shaped as much by the climate of stone as by the march of age. Respiratory ailments were the companions of every winter. The dampness of walls filled the lungs with chill, and coughs echoed through great halls more often than laughter. Bronchitis, asthma, and endless congestion plagued the inhabitants, wearing them down slowly. Without the knowledge of modern remedies, people turned to herbs and prayers, seeking relief in the face of air heavy with moisture. Even the noblest lord could not escape the sting of a cold wind at night. Hildegard of Bingen, the abbess and healer, wrote of remedies for such afflictions. She described warming drinks of wine spiced with herbs, poultices for aching limbs, and oils rubbed into chilled flesh. Her works were treasured, for they spoke of hope amid unending discomfort. Yet remedies could only soften pain, not erase it. The castle's stone always reclaimed its dominion, and with it returned the ailments bred of cold and damp. Children fared worst in these conditions. Their small bodies lacked the strength to fight against freezing draughts. Accounts tell of infants swaddled in layer after layer, yet still succumbing to fevers born of chill air. The cries of the sick echoed in nurseries, attended by nurses who could do little but pray and wrap the little ones tighter. The cost of survival within those walls was often counted in young lives. Hands and feet bore another cruel affliction, chilblains. Skins swelled and blistered from the cold, leaving men unable to grip tools or hold weapons with ease. Servants limped through kitchens, their toes raw from nights spent on icy floors. Nobles too suffered, though their coverings delayed the worst. The condition was so common that it shaped the rhythm of daily labor, slowing every task with the ache of frozen flesh. Fevers struck easily in such environments, often mistaken for divine punishment. Physicians, limited in their understanding, prescribed bleeding or strict diets, remedies that rarely brought true healing. Many accepted illness as part of God's will, a trial to be borne with patience. Yet beneath that resignation was the simple truth. The castle itself was a place that bred sickness as much as it resisted armies. The smell of sickness became familiar, mingling with the smoke of fires and the must of straw. A hall filled with coughing men could feel like a battlefield fought against unseen foes. No rank shielded one from the cold's reach. Servants, knights, and lords alike were touched by the same afflictions. The universality of illness reminded all that within stone walls, human frailty was equal. I still hear the rasping breaths and see the weary eyes of those who suffered through endless winters. Illness was not an exception, but a certainty, carried in the damp, in the draughts, in the weight of stone itself. Castles may have stood strong against swords and arrows, but within their chambers, the cold fought its own war. It was a war that no one truly won. In the cloisters of monasteries, where devotion shaped every breath, rest was not left to comfort, but to discipline. Monks rose from their hard pallets in the darkest hours, summoned by bells to recite prayers in unheated chapels. The cold of stone cloisters seeped into their marrow, yet they embraced it as a form of piety. Their sleep was broken, fragmented by vigils, and they returned to their beds, only to rise again before dawn. Such rhythms influenced not only their bodies, but the very culture of the age. The bedding of these holy men was austere. Straw sacks and coarse woolen blankets were the norm, with luxury forbidden. Some orders even demanded that monks sleep fully clothed, ready to rise without hesitation. Their cells were narrow, their walls bare, their windows unglazed. These chambers echoed the philosophy of denial, where the body's suffering was seen as an offering of devotion. It was a world where cold was not merely endured, but embraced. This practice left a mark beyond the cloister walls. The rhythm of rising at night to pray influenced laypeople who looked to monasteries as models of spiritual strength. Even nobles, in imitation of the monks, sometimes interrupted their sleep for prayers or readings of scripture. The idea that discomfort was a path to virtue spread widely, weaving itself into the fabric of medieval thought. To sleep poorly was, in some minds, to sleep with God. The harshness of these nights shaped health and endurance alike. Monks suffered the same coughs, chills, and pains as castle dwellers, yet they bore them without complaint, recording their suffering as spiritual growth. Many died young from illnesses born of cold stone and thin bedding, yet chronicles also describe their steadfastness, their unwavering return to prayer, even when their bodies weakened. Their lives testified to the power of belief to carry men through hardship. Outside the monasteries, peasants and nobles alike looked upon this endurance with both awe and resignation. If holy men could embrace suffering, then perhaps discomfort was not a burden, but a duty. Such thinking coloured how people accepted the miseries of cold castles. To complain was to risk appearing weak in both spirit and body. Faith gave meaning to endurance, though it did not lessen the shiver of the flesh. Not all monastic rules were equally severe. Some orders permitted softer bedding or warmer clothing, especially in colder climates. Yet even in these more lenient houses, the ideal of simplicity prevailed. Excess was shunned, and sleep was never allowed to become indulgence. In every monastery, the discipline of rest reflected the conviction that time belonged to God, not to slumber. The body was not to be coddled, but trained. The sound of monastic bells carried far beyond the cloisters, marking hours of prayer that echoed across villages and fields. These rhythms shaped the days of farmers and lords alike, reminding them that even in their own disrupted rest, they were joined to a greater order. The monastic way of broken sleep became a mirror of medieval life itself, fragmented, disciplined, and always shadowed by the cold. I recall passing nights near monasteries, hearing the bells toll in darkness, watching lights flicker in the chapels, while the world outside lay still. Their voices rose into the frozen air, steady and unwavering, while the rest of us huddled in our chambers. The monks' endurance gave meaning to the hardship we all endured. In their discipline, one could see the reflection of a world where sleep was never simple, but always tied to faith, duty, and survival. Many imagine knights resting in full plate, swords at their side, as though forever ready for battle. Yet such a picture is more legend than truth. Armor was heavy, restrictive, and ill-suited for rest. No man could sleep long with iron pressing into his ribs, nor with metal edges cutting into his joints. To don armor was to prepare for combat, not slumber. At day's end, even the fiercest warrior sought relief from its weight. Instead, Soldiers and knights alike turned to gambesons, padded jackets worn beneath armor. These garments offered some warmth and could be slept in when danger loomed. During sieges, when the threat of attack was constant, men sometimes kept on parts of their armor, perhaps a helmet close by or a breastplate strapped over a tunic. But to remain encased in steel throughout the night was unbearable. Sweat by day became chill by night, leaving the body weak. Chroniclers of campaigns often describe soldiers stripping down after marches. Armor was stacked in neat rows, guarded carefully, for theft could doom a man. Yet even in safety, sleep was shallow. The fear of surprise attack forced men to remain half alert, their ears attuned to any sound. Rest was taken in fragments, bodies still aching from the burden of iron carried through daylight. True sleep was rare, broken by vigilance and fatigue. The image of warriors always clad in armor persisted in stories because it flattered ideals of valor. Minstrels sang of heroes who never set aside their steel, as though endurance alone made them invincible. But lived reality was less romantic. Men were flesh, vulnerable to cold and exhaustion. Armor served them in combat, but hindered them in all else. To survive, they had to balance readiness with the human need for rest. Sieges brought the hardest choices. In cramped quarters, soldiers often lay in their gambesons, too fearful to strip even to their shirts. The nights were restless, the air foul with sweat, and the stone floor unforgiving. Some wrapped themselves in cloaks over their padded gear, preferring discomfort to vulnerability. It was a grim reminder that war left no space for comfort, only endurance. Nobles, too, avoided armor in their chambers. Instead, they slept with weapons close at hand, swords laid beside beds, shields propped within reach. Guards posted outside their doors carried the burden of constant readiness. The armor remained nearby, but the body was granted relief, for even kings could not escape fatigue. To wear steel while sleeping was not strength, but folly. Medical accounts of the age spoke of sores, rashes, and fevers caused by long hours in armor. The body needed release from the heat and pressure, else sickness would take root. Men who tried to endure too long found themselves weakened when they needed their strength most. The myth of sleeping in armor ignored these truths, yet the scars of soldiers told them plainly. I have lain beside warriors after marches, watching them peel off steel with sighs of relief, collapsing onto straw in little more than their tunics. Their armor clattered into the darkness, as welcome off the body as a burden cast from the soul. The myth may live on in tales, but memory recalls otherwise. Men of flesh, grateful for even the smallest escape from iron's grip. Within the walls of a fortress, childhood was shaped as much by hardship as by privilege. Noble children were raised among attendants, their small bodies swaddled in wool and furs to guard against the cold. Cradles were often placed close to hearths, though always with the fear of sparks too near. I recall seeing little ones bundled so tightly that only their faces showed, their breath rising like mist in the dim air. Even the laughter of youth was shadowed by the chill of stone. Their sleeping arrangements reflected rank. Sons and daughters of lords shared chambers with nurses or tutors, rarely left unattended. They rested on smaller beds lined with blankets, though never beyond the reach of drafts creeping through shutters. Servants' children, when permitted within, lay on the floor or in alcoves, pressed together for warmth. The contrast was stark, yet both noble and common child knew the same reality. Comfort was never complete inside those walls. Nighttime was often interrupted by illness. The damp air fostered coughs, fevers, and chills, and parents turned to prayers and remedies of herbs to protect their children. Physicians advised layering wool upon wool, but even this could not guarantee safety. Many fell ill, their fragile bodies unable to endure what adults accepted as routine. Childhood within castles was marked by constant battle against cold and frailty. Education, too, shaped the rhythm of their nights. Boys destined for knighthood were woken early to train, their sleep cut short by drills or lessons. Girls of noble families, guided by mothers and governesses, learned prayers and courtly manners that filled their days and shortened their rest. The innocence of sleep was surrendered early, replaced with duties that weighed as heavily on them as on their elders. Stories and lullabies offered what comfort they could. Attendants whispered tales by the glow of embers, hoping to distract children from the bite of the night air. Yet even such tenderness was fleeting, for the fire always dimmed, and the draughts always returned. Childhood dreams mingled with the creak of timbers, the bark of dogs, and the distant tread of guards. Peace was never complete within a fortress. In some households, toys and trinkets softened the burden: a carved wooden horse, a ball of cloth, a simple doll. But these treasures offered little when the bedding was damp and the nights unforgiving. The true gift a child longed for was warmth, something no bauble could provide. Even surrounded by wealth, they learned young that castles promised security at the cost of comfort. Servants bore the harder edge of this truth. Their children, if permitted to sleep indoors at all, often lay in kitchens or stables, exposed to smoke, vermin, and cold. While noble children were wrapped in fur, these slept on straw, their tiny hands reddened by the chill. They grew resilient quickly, for survival demanded it, yet one cannot forget the toll taken upon such fragile lives. I remember watching children wake with pale faces, their eyes heavy, their limbs stiff from the night. Their laughter returned with the daylight, but the memory of the cold never left them. Castles raised heirs, soldiers, and servants alike, yet beneath every title lay the same truth. Childhood in stone was no gentle season. It was an apprenticeship in endurance, carved as surely into the young as the walls around them. When a castle came under siege, the hardships of daily life grew sharper, and sleep became almost impossible. Rooms that once held a household swelled with soldiers, servants, and townsfolk seeking shelter. Crowding turned every hall into a dormitory, with bodies packed close together on straw and floors. The press of people brought noise, stench, and restlessness, making slumber a rare luxury. A fortress meant for defense soon felt like a prison. Food scarcity deepened the struggle. As supplies dwindled, bellies ached with hunger, and the weakness that followed left men tossing in uneasy rest. Children whimpered through the night, and parents tried to quiet them with scraps of bread or bowls of thin broth. The smell of rotting stores mixed with sweat and smoke, turning the air heavy. To lie down hungry in such conditions was to discover that the body refuses rest when starved. The fires lit for cooking, and warmth added to the misery. Smoke thickened in poorly ventilated halls, and the sheer number of people made the air stifling. Those close to the hearth coughed and choked, while those further away shivered in the draughts that crept through stone. The balance between cold and suffocation was a cruel one, and there was no escaping its weight. Every breath was another reminder of entrapment. Outside, the enemy's presence ensured that vigilance never ceased. The sound of engines building, of arrows whistling, and of rocks pounding against walls carried through the night. Guards shouted warnings, dogs barked endlessly, and horns sometimes blared in alarm. Even if one's body begged for sleep, the mind remained alert, fearful of sudden breach. The nights of siege stretched long, measured in dread rather than hours. Sanitation collapsed under the strain of so many confined within. Waste was dumped hastily, sometimes within the walls, when sorties were impossible. The smell seeped into chambers, carried on every draught. Vermin multiplied, drawn by scraps and filth, adding bites to already restless bodies. The mingling of hunger, odor, and infestation made night not a time of peace, but of compounded suffering. Illness spread quickly in these conditions. Fever and plague found fertile ground in overcrowded spaces, claiming lives faster than enemy arrows. Chroniclers described the horror of sleepless nights spent beside the sick, the dying, and the dead, with no space to separate them. The coughs and moans of neighbors filled every corner, their echoes blending with the enemy's noise outside. Sleep was consumed by fear and grief. For soldiers, Even brief rest was haunted. They lay in armor or padded gear, weapons within reach, knowing they could be called to defend the walls at any moment. Dreams were pierced by sudden alarms, and exhaustion dulled their strength in battle. Yet they endured, for there was no alternative. Surrender meant worse than sleepless nights. The siege demanded every ounce of resilience, both waking and in fitful slumber. When I remember such times, I see not glory, but shadows of weary faces, hollow eyes, and trembling bodies. A besieged castle was a place of hunger, filth, and unbroken watchfulness, where the walls that promised protection also trapped their people in misery. Sleep was no longer rest, but survival, taken in moments stolen from fear. The stone endured the siege, but the people bore its deepest cost. When darkness fell, the smells of a castle revealed themselves most keenly. Fires dimmed, kitchens quieted, and the mingling of odors long suppressed came forward. Straw that had absorbed sweat and spilled drink released its sourness, chamber pots gave off their stench, and damp clothing hung heavy with mildew. The air became a tapestry of scents, woven from smoke, filth, and human presence. Sleep came not into silence or freshness, but into this unrelenting mixture. Bathing was infrequent, not from neglect but from circumstance. Water was often cold and scarce, and heating it required laborious effort. Men and women might go weeks without cleansing more than face and hands. At night, the smell of unwashed bodies grew stronger, filling the great hall or the chambers where many slept together. To lie in close company meant to breathe the shared scent of toil, a reality accepted as ordinary. Chamber pots stood in corners, necessary in the absence of easy access to privies. At night, when leaving rooms was dangerous or inconvenient, they were used freely. By morning, they spilled or were carried to be emptied, but their presence through the hours of rest made itself known. The mingling of human waste with smoke and damp created an atmosphere few today would imagine tolerable, yet it was the nightly condition of castle dwellers. The kitchens offered their own contribution. The smell of grease and meat lingered long after fires were extinguished, seeping into rafters and clothing. Those who slept nearby enjoyed warmth, but they also endured the odors of spoiled fat and charred food. Rats were drawn to such places, and their presence only worsened the stench. Every space within a fortress bore its own particular discomforts, but none escaped entirely. For servants, the conditions were harsher still. They slept in storerooms or corridors where waste might accumulate, or in stables where animal dung joined the mix. Their nights were marked by the odors of beasts, mold, and smoke, with no escape but endurance. The poor became accustomed to what nobility might have considered unbearable, though nobles themselves were not spared the larger smells of the castle. Rank offered little protection against air shared by all. Some sought relief through herbs. Rushes and straw were scattered with mint, lavender, or rosemary, their scents meant to mask the foulness. In noble chambers, bowls of dried flowers or bundles of herbs were placed to sweeten the air. Yet such measures faded quickly, overpowered by the strength of smoke and sweat. The attempt at fragrance became a fleeting comfort, a reminder of how little mastery people held over their environment. These odors shaped not only the body, but also the mind. To breathe such air through the night was to wake with heaviness, the senses dulled, the spirit weary before the day began. Illness was worsened by these conditions, as lungs labored against the thick atmosphere. What was endured each night became the background to every task of the day, a silent weight carried by all who lived within stone. I remember lying awake, the smells pressing as surely as the cold. The mingling of smoke, waste, and damp straw was as much a part of castle life as its walls and towers. To live within was to surrender to it, for no man, woman, or child could escape the air they shared. Such was the reality of medieval nights. Survival in stone fortresses came not with purity, but with the acceptance of their unyielding odors. When nobles received visitors within their walls, the duty of hospitality carried immense weight. To welcome a guest was to honor them, and their sleeping arrangements reflected the household's standing. Yet even with the finest efforts, comfort was rarely achieved. Guests often found themselves placed in makeshift chambers or along the edges of the great hall, where draughts crept and noise persisted. The grandeur of a fortress did not always extend to its beds. Accounts survive of lords and dignitaries complaining of the cold during their stays. Chronicles mention ambassadors shivering beneath furs, their hosts apologizing for what even wealth could not correct. Heavy blankets were offered, hearths were stoked, yet the stone walls betrayed all efforts. To give a guest warmth was a mark of honor, but even the proudest household could not promise ease when the castle itself resisted every attempt at comfort. In smaller strongholds, guests were sometimes lodged alongside family or retainers, their beds separated by curtains at best. Privacy was scarce, and rest often shallow, disturbed by the sounds of servants moving or animals shifting in nearby quarters. Hospitality was measured not by silence but by survival, ensuring that guests were fed, covered, and safe. What today might be judged as harsh was then the height of generosity. For great feasts or gatherings, the number of visitors swelled far beyond available chambers. In such times, the hall became a sea of bodies, straw spread upon the floor, cloaks laid down as bedding. Noble and commoner alike surrendered to the same restless night, the fire at the hall's center serving as the single source of warmth. The bonds of fellowship were strengthened as all endured together, though sleep itself was broken and thin. Gifts of bedding were sometimes offered as tokens of welcome. A guest might receive a fine blanket or fur, not only as a practical kindness, but as a symbol of respect. Chronicles tell of these exchanges, where the giving of warmth was equal to the giving of bread or wine. In such gestures, one sees how survival and status intertwined, for warmth was as valuable as any jewel. Despite these efforts, some guests carried home complaints, and their words lingered in letters and chronicles. The grandeur of towers and battlements could not mask the misery of nights spent in damp air. These records remind us that castles, though symbols of might, were never sanctuaries of ease. Visitors learned quickly that honor did not erase hardship, and memory often recorded discomfort as vividly as ceremony. Travelers of lesser rank fared even worse, sometimes relegated to stables or storerooms. Their bedding was whatever they carried, their shelter shared with animals or goods. To them, the stone walls still offered safety from raiders and weather, but no warmth. Gratitude was mingled with suffering, for the gift of security came at the cost of rest. The road beyond the castle might have been harsher still, but the fortress was no gentle refuge. I picture those nights, the fire flickering over weary faces, nobles and guests wrapped in heavy furs, servants tending flames that never fully conquered the cold. Hospitality was not measured by luxury, but by survival offered in shared hardship. A castle could shelter its guests, but it could never spare them from the realities of stone. To be welcomed was to be honored, yet even in honor, one shivered through the night. The earliest fortifications, the Motte and Bailey castles of timber, were swift to rise yet fragile against flame. Their walls burned easily, their towers collapsed under siege, and so the age of stone began. As masons shaped blocks into battlements, the silhouette of Europe transformed. Towers grew taller, walls thickened, and keeps stood as immovable guardians. Yet in all these advancements, warmth was never the builder's concern. Protection of land outweighed comfort of body. In time, concentric castles emerged, layered defenses encircling keeps with multiple walls and towers. The design was brilliant in strategy, forcing enemies through rings of resistance. But for those inside, the stone multiplied their suffering. Each additional wall meant more thickness, more chill, more shadows. Families and servants dwelled within these fortresses, not in luxury, but in endurance, their nights defined by the very architecture that promised security. Great halls remained the center of life, no matter how elaborate the fortress grew. The hearth blazed, tapestries hung, yet the size of the hall only magnified the imbalance of heat. Smoke drifted upward, warmth settled near the flames, and the edges of the chamber lay cold as winter fields. Even as masons perfected their craft, no innovation softened the imbalance between defense and daily living. Private chambers became more common in the 12th and 13th centuries, yet they too were shaped by military necessity. Small windows admitted little light, narrow passages cut through thick stone, and stairways twisted to slow intruders. These features made sense in war, but for the sleepers within, they brought draughts, dampness, and an unshakable chill. A noble's solar chamber might have privacy, but never true comfort. The introduction of fireplaces and chimneys brought change, though slowly. By venting smoke more effectively, chambers became clearer, less suffocating. Still, even with these improvements, the reach of warmth was limited. A single hearth could not contend with stone walls 3 feet thick. Progress was real, yet incomplete, for castles were not designed to ease human frailty, but to outlast enemies. Symbolism was ever present in their construction. High towers proclaimed dominance, great gates declared power, and moats testified to wealth. Yet none of these spoke to the reality of those who lay down each night within. Their beds were damp, their breath misted in the air, and their sleep came shallow. Architecture elevated the image of lords, but it neglected the needs of their people. Even as the late Middle Ages brought refinements, ornamental windows, carved facades, decorated chambers, the underlying truth remained. These were fortresses first, homes second. Beauty adorned the surfaces, but the heart of stone remained cold, demanding patience of all who slept within. Defense had triumphed, but humanity paid its cost. I often reflect that the evolution of castles tells a story of strength won at the expense of ease. The walls stood against armies, yet they left their own inhabitants weary, coughing and shivering. Architecture secured lands and kingdoms, but within those triumphs lay countless restless nights. Stone defended, but it never embraced, and that truth lingered long after battles had faded. Of all the places within a fortress, the kitchens held a rare and precious quality: warmth. Fires burned there almost constantly, roasting meats, boiling stews, and baking bread. The great ovens radiated heat that seeped into every corner, drawing weary servants toward them when the day's labours were done. To sleep near such fires was a dangerous privilege, for flames might scorch, but the comfort of warmth was difficult to resist. In the depth of winter, the kitchen became a sanctuary. The smell of cooking lingered through the night. Spices, grease, and smoke clung to walls and rafters, embedding themselves into clothing and hair. Those who rested nearby often dreamed with the sense of meat and bread in their nostrils, though their stomachs remained empty. The mingling of hunger with comfort created a cruel irony. Warmth surrounded them, but food was not theirs to claim freely. Still, even with empty bellies, they preferred the kitchen floor to the icy corridors. Servants knew well the risks of sleeping there. Fires might flare unexpectedly, sparks leaping from logs or embers spilling from ovens. Blankets could smoulder, straw could ignite, and sleepers could awaken choking on smoke. Yet the choice was clear: to endure danger and wake sweating, or to freeze elsewhere in the draught-filled castle. Many chose the danger, calculating that burns were less certain than the misery of stone's cold embrace. The noise of kitchens was another companion. Even in late hours, some work never ceased. Bread prepared for dawn, pots stirred for the next day's meal. Sleep was fragmented by clattering pans, footsteps, and voices of those who laboured into the night. But those resting on the floor accepted the disturbance. They traded silence for warmth, a bargain they rarely regretted, for the body craved heat more than quiet. Animals too found refuge in these spaces. Dogs lingered by the fires, their presence both comfort and nuisance. They fought for scraps and pressed close to sleepers, offering their own warmth. Rats, however, thrived in greater numbers, feeding on crumbs and gnawing on stores. Their scurrying across floors and bedding was constant, yet the sleepers endured, for warmth outweighed disgust. The kitchen was a haven not only for people but for all who sought heat. Nobles seldom lay within such quarters, but they understood their value. Even they, on rare nights of deep winter, might linger longer in kitchens, drawing comfort from the glow before retreating to their chambers. For servants, though, these fires were the closest thing to luxury they would ever know. The kitchen hearth, though smoky and perilous, gave them what no other space in the castle could offer: relief from endless shivering. It was said by some that warmth itself tasted better than food. A man might pass a night hungry, but wake alive if he had slept in the glow of the oven. Others, sleeping cold in distant corridors, sometimes never woke at all. The memory of such stories spread through households, reinforcing the kitchen's place as the secret refuge of survival. In its flames, death and life were balanced together. When I think of the kitchens, I recall not only the heat, but the sight of weary bodies curled against the walls, their faces softened by firelight. The castle was cruel, yet here, for a few hours, men and women could imagine comfort. It was imperfect, filled with noise, smoke, and danger, but it gave something the rest of the fortress denied. In the kitchen's warmth, humanity found its briefest rest. Stone chambers echoed with cold and silence, yet men sought ways to soften them. Among the most common efforts was the hanging of tapestries, woven thick with wool and often richly decorated. Their purpose went beyond beauty. They held back drafts, covered damp walls, and dulled the echoes of vast rooms. When I walked into a hall adorned with them, I felt the difference at once: a muted air, a quietness, and a faint sense of shelter from the stone's unrelenting breath. The imagery upon these cloths told stories of saints, battles, and hunts, but their true worth lay in their thickness. Wool trapped warmth better than bare stone ever could, and the great panels served as crude insulation. Nobles commissioned them at great cost, both to display wealth and to ease the discomfort of their homes. Even then, the improvement was modest, for drafts still crept beneath the seams, whispering into chambers through hidden cracks. For those who could afford them, tapestries became symbols of power as well as protection. To visitors, they spoke of refinement, artistry, and faith. Yet to the household, they were also shields against suffering. The colder the climate, the more heavily the walls were draped, transforming chambers into places where survival was at least somewhat more bearable. Still, beneath their weight lay the same chill, pressing in like an uninvited guest. The labor that created such works was immense. Women in workshops, often under the patronage of noble households, wove threads of wool and silk into elaborate patterns. The process took months, even years to complete, and the result was prized not only for beauty, but also for necessity. Without such efforts, many noble chambers would have been indistinguishable from bare fortresses, stripped of any comfort at all. Servants seldom shared in this modest improvement. Their quarters were left bare, with stone exposed to every draught. The difference between lord and servant was written not only in garments and meals, but also in the very walls around them. Where nobles slept beneath embroidered saints and heroes, servants lay against raw masonry, their breath frosting in the air. The tapestries reflected not only wealth, but division. Even in the noblest chambers, the effect was limited. I remember pressing my hand against the wall behind such a cloth, and feeling the dampness still. The threads dulled its touch, but they did not banish it. At night, the cold crept around the edges and seeped through the floor. No amount of artistry could conquer the nature of stone. The castle itself always had the final word. Travelers often remarked upon the sight of halls heavy with cloth, impressed by their richness yet blind to their necessity. To them, it was spectacle. To those who lived there, it was survival. What appeared as grandeur was in truth a defense against misery. a fragile bulwark woven with patient hands. Beauty and hardship lived side by side, stitched together in every panel. I still see those vast walls, softened by threads yet never truly warm. The flicker of firelight made the woven figures seem alive, their colors glowing in the dark. They did not silence the cold, but they gave comfort to the eye and heart, if not the flesh. In their presence, one could almost imagine the castle gentler than it was, even while shivering beneath heavy furs. Beyond the castle walls, peasants lay in cottages of wood and wattle, their dwellings far humbler but often warmer. Low ceilings and central hearths allowed heat to spread through the single room, enveloping families who huddled close. The smoke escaped through a hole in the roof, leaving the air thick but the bodies comforted. While nobles boasted of towers, peasants sometimes rested with greater ease, warmed by the closeness of their simple homes. The hearth was the true heart of these cottages. Families gathered around it not only for food, but for survival. At night, embers glowed faintly as children curled against their parents, wrapped in whatever blankets could be found. Chickens might roost in corners, and animals sometimes shared the room, their warmth adding to the air. Sleep was communal, crowded, and far from clean. Yet it carried a warmth unknown to stone castles. By contrast, nobles reclined in lofty chambers, surrounded by furs and servants, yet restless under the cold breath of their walls. Their wealth provided layers of fabric and feather beds, but the stone devoured heat as swiftly as it was given. They enjoyed protection against raiders, but not against the misery of the chill. The irony was stark. Those who seemed most powerful often slept less soundly than those who had little. Peasants endured discomfort of their own. Smoke stung their eyes and lungs, fleas thrived in their straw, and the stench of animals filled the room. Yet their huts retained heat with surprising efficiency. The same dampness that troubled them spared them the draughts that haunted castles. Their nights were harsh, but they were not pierced through with the icy breath that seeped from stone walls. Survival was shared warmth rather than solitary struggle. When winter deepened, peasants spread fresh rushes on floors and added layers of straw to bedding. They wore their work garments to bed, often still damp, but body heat quickly dried them. The fire was fed with scraps of wood or dung, and though the smoke choked, it also lingered, keeping the air warmer. Rest was not comfortable by modern measure, but it was steady, unbroken by the cavernous cold of the great hall. The nobility often looked down upon the cottages of their tenants, seeing only poverty in their cramped rooms. Yet they did not grasp that within those modest walls, warmth was shared more easily than in chambers of stone. Security and status divided them, but the peasant's hearth brought a closeness to nature that the nobleman's tapestries could never match. Sleep there was humble, but more human. Chroniclers sometimes noted this irony. While lords wrapped themselves in ermine and still shivered, peasants laughed together by their fires before sinking into deep communal rest. The disparity of life was not only in labor and wealth, but in the quality of sleep itself. Castles defended bodies from swords, yet cottages defended them from the cold. In one, there was grandeur without warmth. In the other, poverty with a measure of ease. I have walked through both worlds, and I remember the lessons they carried. To sleep in stone was to endure loneliness with wealth. To sleep in wood was to endure closeness with hardship. Neither offered peace, but each revealed truth. Survival was not the gift of walls or riches, but of fire, bodies, and resilience. And in this, the peasant sometimes knew a comfort the lord never touched. Over time, necessity forced builders to confront the cruelty of the cold. Early castles had relied on open hearths, but as centuries passed, new designs emerged. Fireplaces began to appear in chambers, their flames enclosed, their heat more directed. The invention of chimneys in the 12th century marked a turning point, for smoke could at last be carried upward rather than lingering thickly indoors. Yet such changes came slowly. and many continue to shiver long after the idea was born. The earliest fireplaces were crude, often shallow recesses in the wall with smoke funneled through narrow vents. Though imperfect, they brought some relief, allowing smaller rooms to remain clearer of haze. Nobles were among the first to benefit, commissioning masons to incorporate these improvements into private solas. Still, the cost of such work meant that many chambers, especially those of servants, remained without them, reliant on the old, suffocating hearths. As techniques advanced, larger castles began to boast flues that allowed multiple rooms to share a single chimney. This innovation spread warmth more widely, though unevenly. The rooms closest to the fire glowed with heat, while distant spaces received little more than a whisper of warmth. Those who lived in the shadows of the fortress still endured drafts, their lives untouched by improvements reserved for lords and ladies. Portable devices such as braziers also gained popularity. Filled with hot coals, they could be carried from room to room, providing warmth where no hearth stood. Yet they were dangerous, easily overturned, their embers setting rushes or straw alight. Some households hesitated to use them, fearing fire more than frost. Others embraced them, accepting the risk for the chance of a few hours of comfort in the night. Hot stones wrapped in cloth offered another small innovation. Heated in fires, they were carried to beds, placed at feet or beneath blankets. For children and the elderly, such stones were treasured, easing the bite of winter nights. These humble measures, though simple, reveal how desperate people were for warmth. Even the smallest invention became a tool of survival in the unyielding climate of castles. Not all regions embraced these changes equally. In southern Europe, where winters were milder, the need was less urgent. Castles there often relied on courtyards and open spaces, focusing on relief from heat rather than cold. But in the north, where snow and frost reigned, the push for better heating was constant. Still, even in these harsher lands, innovations arrived unevenly, leaving many to suffer in the shadow of progress. By the later Middle Ages, fireplaces had become more refined, with decorative mantels and carved stonework. They were symbols of wealth as much as comfort, admired by visitors for their artistry. Yet behind the carvings, their purpose remained practical, to fight the relentless chill of stone. Innovation had made life more bearable, but never luxurious. Castles were still fortresses first, and homes only second. I have sat by such fires, watching the flames flicker in newly built chimneys, feeling the rare relief of warmth held steady. Yet I also remember the halls without them, where smoke choked the lungs and frost crept over blankets. Innovation eased the suffering, but it never erased it. The struggle with cold remained, for stone was always stronger than flame, and human comfort always fragile within its grasp. The bite of winter was felt most cruelly in the fortresses of the north. In Scandinavia, in the Scottish Highlands, and across the British Isles, stone walls rose against winds that carried snow and sleet. The cold there was not a passing discomfort, but a force that shaped every breath. I recall walking through such halls and seeing frost creep along the inside of windows, the air so chilled that breath hung thick even near the hearth. These were places where stone seemed to side with winter rather than resist it. The walls were thicker in these regions, built to withstand storms as much as armies. Yet their mass only deepened the cold, drawing heat into themselves and leaving chambers hollow and icy. Even when fires blazed, the warmth stayed close to the flames, while the edges of rooms remained frozen. Servants placed rushes on floors to soften the chill, but they quickly grew damp, adding to the misery. Sleep in such places was restless at best. Chroniclers of the North often remarked upon the hardships. They wrote of rivers freezing solid, of harvests failing under sudden frosts, and of families huddled together for survival within castles. Accounts describe nobles wrapped in bearskins, their children piled under furs, yet still waking with stiffened limbs. The strength of stone was powerless against such climates, and the body learned humility beneath its weight. In these lands, Wool and fur became not luxuries, but necessities. Sheepskin cloaks, wolf pelts, and thick woolen blankets were gathered in abundance. The nobility hoarded them, while peasants struggled to keep warm with little more than patched garments. Still, even the wealthiest could not escape the northern chill. They might sleep with layers of fur, yet their breath still clouded the air above their beds. The servants endured even harsher nights. Many were forced to sleep in stables or by the kitchens, crowding together with animals for warmth. Horses and cattle gave off a heat that stone could not provide, though the smell of dung accompanied it. These arrangements were far from clean, but survival cared little for refinement. For the poor, warmth was worth any compromise. Architecture adapted slowly to the challenge. Some castles added smaller chambers, easier to heat, while others built enclosed passageways to shield against the wind. Yet these were modest improvements, for the climate itself remained an adversary beyond control. The people of Northern Europe did not conquer the cold. They endured it, season after season, night after night. Their resilience became their only true shield. The effect of such nights reached into health and spirit. Coughs lingered, fevers spread, and joints stiffened under the strain of long winters. Yet alongside these burdens, the people developed a hardened endurance. Children raised in such castles grew accustomed to hardship, their bodies shaped by frost, their minds by patience. Cold became not only a condition but a teacher. When I think of northern fortresses, I recall their beauty as much as their misery. Towers rising against snowy skies, halls lit with flickering firelight, and people wrapped in furs, whispering prayers through the long nights. These castles stood proud against invaders, but within their walls, the greatest enemy was often the winter itself. And though stone endured, the people inside bore the deeper struggle. Far to the south, where the sun burned brighter, castles bore different burdens. In Spain, Italy, and the lands of the Mediterranean, winters were gentler, but summers could be suffocating. The thick stone walls that chilled northern dwellers now trapped heat under the blazing sun. By day, the chambers grew stifling, and by night, the air lingered heavy, denying the coolness needed for rest. The fortress that promised safety also became a furnace. Designs adapted to these climates. Builders favored courtyards and balconies, where air might circulate and shadows bring relief. Windows were larger than in the north, some fitted with shutters to allow breezes. Arched arcades gave shade to walkways, and towers rose high to catch passing winds. These features softened the heat by day, but once the sun set, the stone continued to radiate warmth, making sleep uneasy. Nobles retreated to upper chambers, hoping for breezes through open shutters. Yet mosquitoes and other insects intruded, drawn by the night air. Servants often fanned their masters as they tried to rest, a nightly labor recorded in chronicles and depicted in art. Comfort was fragile, balanced between stifling heat within and the nuisance of the night outside. What cold tormented the north, heat burdened the south. The poorer inhabitants adapted in humbler ways. Some chose to sleep in courtyards or even upon rooftops, where the open air granted some relief. Families lay under the stars, wrapped in light cloths, seeking rest in the embrace of night winds. These practices reflected a truth older than castles themselves. Survival often meant adapting beyond the walls, using the sky itself as a roof. Moisture remained a problem even in southern lands. Winter rains soaked the stone, and dampness clung to walls, though less severe than in the north. The cycle of seasons demanded flexibility, chill in the short winters, suffocation in the summers. For those who lived within Mediterranean castles, sleep was always challenged by extremes, though of a different kind. No season offered full ease. Architecture carried echoes of past empires. Roman and Islamic influences blended into designs that favored beauty as well as function. Mosaic floors, carved stone, and decorative arches adorned many castles, creating spaces of striking appearance. Yet beneath the artistry, the same truth persisted. Walls built for defense gave little thought to human comfort. Whether in shadowed halls or sunlit courtyards, the struggle for restful sleep endured. Travelers from the north often remarked with envy on the warmth of Mediterranean winters. Yet they did not stay long enough to feel the oppression of summer. Chroniclers from Spain wrote of lords tossing under linen sheets, servants waving fans through the night, and chambers heavy with heat even after midnight. The hardships changed form, but never disappeared. Nature found its way inside, no matter the design. I remember standing on a castle balcony in Italy, the air thick with the scent of the sea, the night warm against the skin. Stars shone bright, yet sleep eluded those within the fortress. The stone glowed faintly, still hot from the day's sun. There was beauty in those nights, but no peace. Castles in the south carried their own trials, proving that whether under frost or flame, life within stone was never easy. When the body trembled against the chill of stone, people turned to remedies both simple and sacred. Physicians of the Middle Ages prescribed drinks warmed with spices, wine infused with cinnamon, honey, or cloves, meant to heat the blood from within. These concoctions, called possets, were taken before bed, their warmth lingering briefly in the chest. I remember the faint comfort they offered, a fleeting fire swallowed in the face of the castle's enduring cold. Herbal knowledge was prized. Sage, rosemary, and thyme were burned or steeped, believed to strengthen lungs weakened by damp air. Lavender was scattered into bedding, both to repel vermin and to soothe troubled sleep. In monasteries, gardens cultivated such herbs with care, their use passed from monk to layman as remedies against the night. Yet no matter how faithful the practice, the walls remained indifferent, exhaling chill through every seam. The use of heated stones was widespread. Pulled from the fire, wrapped in cloth, they were carried to bed and placed at the feet or chest. Their heat faded quickly, but for a short time, they transformed the bed into a haven of relief. Families cherished them, passing the stones between children, repeating the ritual each night. These small acts revealed how survival depended on simple ingenuity, more than wealth. Some turned to oils and ointments. Rubbed into the skin, they promised to guard the body against frostbite and stiffness. Recipes varied: animal fat mixed with herbs or beeswax blended with resin. The scent of these mixtures clung to the skin, a shield fashioned from what nature offered. They did not conquer the cold, but they dulled its sharpness, making rest at least tolerable. Religious remedies carried equal weight. Prayers to saints were spoken before sleep, invoking protection against the chill and illness it might bring. Saint Blaise was called upon for throat ailments, Saint Roche for plague, and Saint Apollonia for pain. Faith wove itself into every bedchamber, reminding people that endurance was not only physical but spiritual. The strength of belief was sometimes the only warmth they carried. Clothing played its part in these nightly struggles. Woolen socks, long shirts, and caps were layered carefully, with the understanding that the body's own heat was the best defense. Wealthier households had fur-lined garments, while the poor relied on patched and rough-spun wool. In both cases, garments were worn day and night until they carried the odor of sweat and smoke. Cleanliness was sacrificed for warmth. The pursuit of remedies was often unequal. Nobles could afford spices and fine wines, their chambers perfumed with herbs brought from distant lands. Peasants made do with garlic, onions, or whatever herbs grew nearby. Yet even with wealth, the results were fleeting. The same complaints echoed through chronicles. Coughs persisted, joints ached, and nights remained restless. The remedies softened hardship but could not undo the nature of stone. I recall the scent of herbs burning in a brazier, the taste of spiced wine lingering on my tongue, the brief relief of warmth at my feet. These were fragile victories, soon undone by draughts that returned like relentless enemies. Remedies offered hope more than cure, a way to face the night with courage. In the end, survival was less about comfort than the determination to endure. Among the noble classes, rest did not follow a single stretch of hours as many imagine today. Instead, sleep often came in two parts, broken by a waking period in the middle of the night. After lying down soon after dusk, nobles would rise around midnight, lighting candles or tending small fires before returning to bed. In these quiet hours, prayers were whispered, letters read, or even conversations held with attendants. The rhythm reflected not indulgence, but necessity shaped by cold and darkness. This segmented rest was encouraged by the church, which valued nocturnal devotion. The interval between sleeps became a time for prayer, reflection, or penance. Some nobles used the hours to read from psalters or to consult chaplains. Others, more practical, took the opportunity to check on household security, ensuring guards were wakeful and fires controlled. The castle itself demanded such vigilance, and the body adjusted to the rhythm imposed by faith and fear alike. Private chambers shaped the experience of these patterns. Solars were dim, their fires small, and drafts unavoidable. The break in sleep often came naturally, as the cold grew more biting when fires dwindled. Waking in the chill, nobles wrapped themselves in cloaks or walked briefly to restore warmth. It was in such moments that the contrast between wealth and vulnerability was most evident. Fine garments and feather beds did not spare them from shivering nights. Feasts and obligations further disrupted sleep. Nobles hosted banquets that stretched late into the evening, leaving little time for rest before the first segment of sleep began. Hunting, warfare, or travel often forced adjustments, pushing men and women into irregular hours. The flexibility of segmented sleep was, in some ways, an advantage. It allowed the body to adapt to duty, though at the cost of steady and restorative rest. Dreams were regarded with seriousness in this world. In the long nights, nobles often reflected on visions seen in sleep, interpreting them as messages or omens. The first sleep, heavy and deep, was said to bring dreams of the body, while the second sleep, lighter, revealed matters of the soul. Such beliefs colored the way sleep was valued, turning it into more than a simple necessity. It became a spiritual experience, a dialogue with the unseen. Illnesses made the segmented pattern more difficult. Cold air worsened coughs, and rising in the middle of the night often left the sick weaker still. Physicians advised warm drinks or layers of furs before returning to bed, but even so, the disruption added to suffering. Yet the practice persisted, for it was deeply ingrained in the culture. Nobles considered endurance of discomfort part of their duty, a reflection of strength and discipline. Attendants played a vital role in this rhythm. They kept fires alive, prepared warm drinks, and stood ready should their lord or lady need them during the waking hours. Their own rest was fractured, snatched in brief moments while waiting for the next command. The nobility's segmented sleep was thus sustained by the fatigue of others, woven into the broader fabric of service that supported castle life. I think often of these nights, of nobles rising to pray by candlelight while frost clung to the windows. Their wealth bought furs, feathers, and attendants, yet not the uninterrupted peace of slumber. Their sleep was carved into pieces, shaped by faith, fear, and the demands of stone. It was not a gift freely given, but a rhythm of endurance that mirrored the world they ruled, fragmented, fragile, and never truly at rest. The climate of Europe shifted across centuries, shaping the nights of those who dwelled in stone. Between the 9th and 13th centuries came what we now call the medieval warm period. Harvests were fuller, winters somewhat gentler, and though castles were still cold, survival was easier. Crops fed the people, wine flowed more steadily, and the chill within walls was endured with fewer fears of famine. Yet even then, stone never lost its icy grip when the sun set. By the 14th century, the warmth gave way to a harsher age. The Little Ice Age descended, bringing colder winters, fiercer storms, and frozen rivers, Where once water had flowed freely, castles, already difficult to heat, became near unbearable. Records speak of the Thames in London freezing solid, markets held upon its ice, and villagers crossing rivers on foot where bridges once were needed. Inside fortresses, frost clung to walls as if determined to remind all of nature's dominion. The chroniclers of the time wrote of harvest failures, of hunger spreading as crops withered in shorter growing seasons. Famine pressed heavily upon both peasant and noble, for even the well-born could not feast if the land gave little. In such times, sleep was troubled not only by cold, but by empty stomachs. The great halls that once echoed with feasts became quieter, filled with the sound of coughs and murmured prayers against hunger. These colder centuries reshaped the very fabric of survival. Firewood grew scarce, for forests were stripped to feed countless hearths. Men trudged farther into the wilderness to gather fuel, returning weary, their efforts quickly consumed in flames that offered little relief. The castle fires glowed brighter, but the cold seeped in faster, and families huddled closer than ever before. The demand for warmth revealed how fragile human power remained. The cold reached even into the health of nations. Diseases found easy prey in weakened bodies, and pestilence spread with greater force in the damp chill. The Great Plague of the 14th century, though carried by more than weather, thrived in these conditions. Cold nights weakened resistance, and the castle walls, though strong against siege, gave no defense against illness. Survival became less a matter of rank than of fortune. Architecture too bore the mark of these shifts. Builders sought smaller chambers, more efficient fireplaces, and thicker tapestries to meet the harsher winters. Castles that once symbolized power grew heavier and more enclosed, their defenses against climate as important as their defenses against men. Yet still the cold triumphed, for even the most carefully laid stones could not undo the work of the sky. The change in seasons altered more than buildings. It reshaped the spirit of the age. Songs and writings carried notes of hardship, of winters long and merciless, of prayers for spring that seemed slow to come. Nobles and peasants alike learned that nature ruled as firmly as any monarch. Each breath misting in the air was a reminder that no fortress, however mighty, could banish the hand of climate. I remember those winters most vividly, the stillness of snow stretching endless across the fields, the stars cold and sharp above the battlements, the fires burning low while families clung to one another for warmth. Castles were not only monuments of stone, but witnesses to the shifting temper of the earth. And in those centuries of cold, the night was not merely dark. It was a test of human endurance written in frost. To this day, the thought of a night within castle walls stirs the imagination. The high towers, the flicker of torches, the echo of footsteps on stone. These images linger in stories and dreams. Yet the fascination endures, not because those nights were comfortable, but because they were so unforgiving. In the mingling of grandeur and hardship lies the truth of the medieval world. Power displayed upon the battlements, misery endured within the chambers. The very contrast gives castles their hold upon memory. By day they stood as symbols of dominance, banners flying proudly above their gates. By night they revealed their other face, one of cold, smoke, and restless slumber. To walk their halls in darkness was to feel both awe and unease, a reminder that human might is always shadowed by human frailty. Their beauty was undeniable, but it was lined with suffering. For nobles, these nights reflected the burden of rank. They lay beneath heavy furs, their wealth unable to purchase comfort beyond a few stolen hours of rest. Servants, by contrast, endured the same cold with far less protection, their loyalty tested as much in sleep as in toil. Yet together they shared the same stone, the same draughts, the same coughs echoing in the night. Castles united men in discomfort, even as they divided them in privilege. The memory of those nights has been carried into legend, but it is the hardship, not the ease, that makes them enduring. Songs, tales, and later histories speak of torchlit halls and shadowed corridors, of knights restless in their beds and servants huddled by the fire. They remind us that the grandeur of the Middle Ages was never separate from its struggles. To imagine the knight in a castle is to imagine humanity pressed hard against its limits. Even now, when one walks the ruins of such places, the silence of their stones whispers of those restless nights. The walls seem to breathe with damp, the narrow windows still admit draughts, and the echo of footsteps recalls the night watch. Though centuries have passed, the memory of their chill remains, carried as much by imagination as by history. The fascination lies not in romance, but in reality. The endurance of those who lived within castles is perhaps their most overlooked legacy. They did not merely fight wars or govern lands. They endured cold, illness, and discomfort with a patience that speaks across the ages. Their resilience carved itself into the very fabric of those walls. The stone tells not only of battles fought outside, but of countless nights survived inside. What captivates us is not that castles promised peace, but that they revealed the cost of survival. Every draught, every cough, every sleepless hour was part of life behind the walls. To dream of castles today is to dream not only of power, but of the resilience required to inhabit them. The night reveals what daylight hides, that greatness is always accompanied by struggle. I look back upon those nights with a quiet reverence. The fire's faint glow, the shivering breath, the unbroken strength of those who endured. It is these that linger more than banners or crowns. Castles were monuments not only of stone, but of the human will to persist against hardship. And that is why, even now, the memory of a castle night still commands both awe and sorrow.